folks. This is Inside Indiana Overtime. This is Alex McCarthy. This is Zach Osterman. This is my apartment. We are not in Minnesota, which was apparently quite nice today, which for Minnesota this time of year is like low 30s and sun, which isn't much more than we got here. I think we got high 30s and lots of rain. And Indiana got, to be blunt, what it deserved, probably, in Minneapolis today. And this was always a tricky game for Indiana. It was a week off after a really big stretch where you had to play Ohio State and Michigan State. In the middle, you had to play your rival, Purdue. And people kind of looked at that little four-game stretch as maybe a defining moment in Indiana's season. And then they had to go to a place, it's kind of funny, and it's not excusing it at all, but Indiana got Illinois when Illinois desperately needed a win. Mm-hmm. And it got Minnesota when Minnesota desperately needed a win. For different reasons, they lost those two games. What's concerning, I think, and I wrote about this in my post-game column, and I wanted to get your thoughts, Alex, and that sounded incredibly pretentious. I apologize. What was concerning about Illinois, and certainly what was concerning tonight, was there was no mystery in what Minnesota did. I mean, They rebound the ball. I mean, Ken Pom numbers have their offensive rebounding percentages better than any other team, save Old Dominion 2 years ago in the last 10. So no other team from a high major conference has come close. I mean, not even close. We're talking 2 or 3 more percentage points. They were at 44.1 coming into today, and that number's going up after tonight. In rebounding the ball offensively, they also turned the ball over a ton. And Indiana, talked about, they were going to prepare for the top 10 Minnesota, the one that they saw in Bloomington on January 12th. And, they needed to limit their offensive rebounds, control Trevor Mbakwe, and force him to make mistakes. They didn't do any of those things. And we talked about this after the Butler game. We talked about it after Wisconsin. We talked about it after Illinois. Indiana said coming into the game it knew what it needed to do to win, and it just didn't do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like Minnesota didn't perform differently than the scouting report would say. I mean, they're the top rebounding team, top offensive rebounding team in the Big Ten, and I think they turn the ball over more than any other Big Ten team.
They're like 275th in the country, and it's not an exaggeration. I think that's what they were coming into this game in turnover percentage.
Yeah, and they did turn the ball over fairly frequently, but
only 11 times.
Right, and really the only turnovers they made were just mistakes.
Yeah, they weren't forced.
It wasn't.
Yeah, that's
a
good point.
On their own accord, they made quite a few decisions that kind of made you scratch your head. But you didn't see that in a few incredible, Victor Oladipo darting in front of, an Andre Holland's pass or actively forcing those turnovers. You just saw maybe sometimes where Minnesota's offense was a little bit confused and the ball went inside when it should have gone out, and it kind of forced itself into a turnover.
Or unfocused.
Yeah, but there wasn't that active IU pressure to force those turnovers. So I mean, they stayed very true to their scouting report. I mean, they had, I think, 23 offensive rebounds,
which
was more than double
defensive rebounds.
Yeah, which was more than double what IU got on offense, and they out-rebounded IU, collectively by 14. So there's, like you said, no mystery. I mean, Trevor Mbakwe from the opening moments was exactly what you expect. He came right at he and Christian Watford started on each other, and he went right at Watford.
And went right at Zeller.
And right at, I mean, he came right at people, scored, and both, I mean, Watford I think was limited to 6 minutes in the first half because Mbakwe immediately got him in foul trouble, and then Zeller eventually, of course, fouled out right near the end of the game. So just Mbakwe's aggressiveness, which we know what you're gonna get from him, really kind of gave IU's front court a lot of trouble and kept him out of a lot of the game and kept him kind of neutralized. And there was a lot of on Twitter, there's a lot of kind of Zeller, there you go, he's not ready for the NBA, he's not ready for this or that, or stuff like that, because you saw Mbakwe just kind of exploit Zeller's weakness, which is at times, just kind of fronting him and going right at him.
Well, what was, I think, really concerning about Mbakwe was just Minnesota set the tone for the game right away. And there were, as there probably always are with any Big Ten game, there were some shouts for some questionable foul calls and things like that in both halves, particularly in the first half. But Minnesota, from its first possession, basically sort of just set the course of the game. Said it was going to be fit. They wanted to play physical. They wanted to scrap. I mean, make everything a scrap for a rebound inside. And the officials said, okay, I mean, and honestly, if you can talk about individual calls here or there, but you have to at least give this officiating crew credit. They were pretty consistent with the way they called the game, right or wrong, fouls or not fouls. Everything was pretty even in terms of contact, what they let go and what they did back and forth most of the night. And we've talked about this before. Sometimes Indiana still struggles to, it's not so much momentum as it is coming back to that word, that word tone, and the idea of who really feels like they're controlling the game, the pace of the game, the flow of the game, the level of physicality with which the game is being played. When Indiana can set that early, it does very well. It did that at Ohio State. It even did that at Michigan State. I mean, throughout the game, you never quite felt like Indiana was out of that game. There were moments tonight where I watched, and I think I even said this at one point, either on our board or on Twitter, where Minnesota was losing, and it still felt like the Gophers were in control of the game because they were the ones that were hustling more for loose balls. They were beating Indiana to 50-50 balls. They were playing more physical. They were challenging Indiana. Indiana, there's a difference between backing down and not stepping up. Indiana did not play hard tonight, but they didn't step up. They didn't bring the same urgency and the same intensity that Minnesota did, and you saw it every time Minnesota pulled in an offensive rebound. I mean, they literally, I can think of at least one, maybe even two possessions where they had fourth chance. I mean, where they got a shot, a rebound, a shot and a rebound or an IU. I mean, by the end of the game, Indiana was fumbling rebounds out of bounds. They were dropping rebounds or steals that they had in their hands. And Steve McLean even said, because Tom Crean, I guess, for whatever reason, handed off post-game radio duties to Steve McLean. And he even said, he didn't say it unprompted, but Don Fisher asked him a question. He said, well, Coach, you didn't turn the ball over a lot tonight. He said, yeah, we didn't, but we turned the ball over a lot in crucial situations. We had some turnovers at really key moments, so it wasn't like the number was high. Indiana also only had 11 turnovers, but they were giving the ball away at really important moments. It just felt like Indiana was a step slower all night, was just second best, and couldn't figure out a way to match Minnesota's intensity and physicality and really get into the same gear with Minnesota. They had several chances, not unlike the Illinois game, really, to maybe take over the game, and or at least maybe get control of that pace and that flow, and they just didn't capitalize on any of them. They couldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think they had the largest lead of either team of the game at 8 points, and they were never able to push that to double digits or push that.
I think they had that when Trevor Mbakwe went to the bench with foul trouble. It was either 6 or 8 at one point in the second half when he went to the bench with foul trouble,
and they just couldn't, for some reason, they couldn't exactly capitalize on that. In the first half, they did. I mean, they were down, I think maybe 4 or 6 points, and then Mbakwe goes to the bench, and Indiana goes on a 10-0 run, including a ridiculous 5-point possession, to retake the lead. And that's when you kind of thought, okay, they've been kind of lurking, within striking distance of Minnesota this whole time, and now it looks like they're taking charge of this game, and they're going to be able to, if more things go their way, if Farrell gets some shots to go down in the second half, or if Watford is able to stay on the floor for longer amounts of time, then you can think that Indiana's going to be able to kind of grab control of this game and put unranked Minnesota, behind them. But that just never happened. And even when they were behind, when Indiana was, 3, 4, 5 points behind, it felt like they were down, 7 or 8 instead of 3 or 4. I mean, it felt like they needed some kind of 5-point possession when they were only down 4. Just the whole time it felt, and he said this, it just felt like Minnesota was in control the whole time. Both because of the crowd sounded incredible tonight at the barn. We couldn't judge any more than you could on TV. But it sounded. I mean, just from the feel.
It was the barn. I mean, it's well known in the Big Ten. It's a historic arena. It's it's intimate. it's loud when it wants to be. It's a tough place to play, and
Yeah. And from watching on TV, it just the whole time it felt like even when Indiana was ahead, it just felt like Minnesota was only a few minutes away from retaking the lead, or a 3-point Minnesota lead just felt large. Even in the first half, a couple times I kind of did a double take, thinking, oh, Minnesota's only up 3 or 4 right now, when it feels like they're up 8 or 9. So it was just the whole feel of the game just kind of was slanted away from IU the whole time.
They were never, and people wonder a lot if Indiana kind of needs that one dominant player that can step up and take over a game. I think people look to Victor Oladipo probably more than anyone else in this team, just because he kind of can do a little bit of everything for this team. But I think the reality is that Indiana's group dynamic is one that relies on everyone, and relies on everyone to be alert and focused and making plays, so that it's not just one guy that ends the night with 26 points and 10 rebounds and 7 steals and 4 assists. It's that some 2 guys brought this and one more guy brought this, and yes, okay, he had certainly the stars performance, but we also got this from these players, et cetera, et cetera. And this is, I think, in some ways, and this is a little bit unscientific, but in some ways, I think, again, we've seen this in a lot of Indiana's losses this year, and obviously there have only been 4 of them, but where it felt like too often players were just kind of waiting for something to happen. There wasn't a lot of forcefulness in there were a lot of possessions in the second half that included just a lot of dribbling around the perimeter, or a lot of Yogi Ferrell just kind of running around with the ball, trying to, I think, basically see if he could just find an unexpected soft spot in the Minnesota defense. And you never felt like there was kind of this concerted effort to just take a deep breath and go forward with one like kind of lockstep united movement. And I think that Indiana, I don't necessarily think they need that dominant player, but they need to have a dominant team personality if they're going to make the Final Four this year, if they're going to win a Big Ten championship, if they're going to realize these goals that they have for themselves. They can't get into these weird funks where they just kind of seem to let the game happen around them, rather than trying to be forceful about taking control of the game. I mean, people got onto Yogi Ferrell for his finishing around the rim, but he tied Victor Oladipo for most field goals tonight, and a lot of times it felt like he was 2 of 10 from the floor, but a lot of times it felt like he was just trying to make something happen.
Yeah, and
which is to say, whereas it felt like other guys weren't or couldn't for one reason or another.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at the night, I mean, Yogi Ferrell was only a few collective inches away from shooting, 5 for 10 or 6 for 10, where he had a lot of really good looks at within.
But if a 6-foot point guard is driving on a team that's as athletic and defensively talented around the rim as Minnesota, that's not. I mean, that's just not your best shot. It's just not. And it even felt at the end of the game. There were a couple, and I'll now turn it around on Ferrell a little bit, but there are a couple times where he just kind of came down and threw up a 3, and when you think, look, it only takes you usually in just the movement of the ball in your offense 5 or 6 seconds to get somebody a decent look. Try that. Victor Oladipo at the end of the game, kind of basically Indiana's last shot, had that corner 3 blocked by Rodney Williams. If he ball fakes and goes around him, he gets a dunk and maybe a foul. And I'm not saying Indiana wins the game, but it felt like Indiana spent the whole night chasing the game and could not figure out a way to exert itself on the pace, on the flow, whatever broad, vague term you want to use. We can bring you stats that back this up in a number of different ways, but it felt like Indiana never figured out how to really, really get itself going the way it can. And I think that's something they've struggled with in their losses. Certainly Wisconsin, certainly Illinois, particularly in the second half when we talk again about some of these missed chances to take control of games. And then tonight, when it just kind of felt, like I said, like Indiana was chasing the game the whole night. You kept kind of saying to yourself, well, they're not playing well, but they're still in it. They're not playing well, but they're still in it. Well, at some point that had to turn around, and in rebounding, in shooting. They were only 42% from the floor tonight. In contributions from key players, this is the first time all year that Cody Zeller and Christian Watford have combined for 2 single-digit scoring.
Yeah.
Like, in other words, it's the first game all year where neither of them has broken 10 points scoring.
And it's the first Big Ten game where Watford hasn't scored.
Hasn't scored,
It's the first 2013 game. First game since Butler, where he hasn't scored at least 10 points.
It wasn't death by 1,000 paper cuts, but it was just kind of a lot of things adding up or snowballing on Indiana, and we've seen Indiana handle that before. Tonight they just didn't.
Yeah,
and it.
Yeah, and without that first half from Jordan Hulls, there wasn't really a big, like you said, individual performance. I mean, Oladipo had a really quiet 16 points.
Yeah.
And Hulls, after making 4 3-pointers and scoring 14 points in the first half, just had one long three with 4.5 seconds left, or however long was left.
Only took 3 shots in the second half.
Yeah. With a guy who's shooting that well and looks that hot in the first half, in a basketball sense, it seems like you would make a more concerted effort to get him the ball and kind of run your offense a little bit more.
Well, Minnesota clearly tried to take him away,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where you needed Zeller or Watford, or maybe even someone off the bench to step up and force Minnesota to make that. I mean, that's what makes Indiana so tough to play, is they force you to make the second adjustment and the third adjustment. You can't just say, okay, now we'll do this and it'll fix things, because they can score on you so many different ways. They can defend you when they're playing well, when they can defend you so many different ways. They've got guards that can rebound in addition to forwards that can rebound. They've got a 6'9" power forward, essentially, who can shoot threes better than anyone else in the conference. And when they are on their game, they are just a matchup nightmare. And it's not just in the sense of 1 through 5 who you got. It's what do you talk about in the huddle? What do you address and how? What do you take away, and how is that going to help you to not get burned by these other things? Tonight, Indiana couldn't force Minnesota into that second adjustment or that third adjustment. Once Minnesota took Hulls away, Indiana had nowhere else to go with its offense, and
Yeah, they were just not. It never seemed like they were running the offense that they wanted to run, especially late. Where they were only down 4 or 5 points, but it seemed like they, like you said, Farrell comes up and takes a really quick three, where you can run your offense just as you don't need a three, you don't need a quick score. And you see that with a bunch of teams where a 5-point deficit, where you make a 5-point or 4-point deficit look a lot bigger because you're just not running your offense and you're not doing what usually works for you, where you're changing your kind of approach in order to try and make up ground really quickly, when in reality, I mean, if you just, run, I mean, Indiana scores over 80 points a game, there's not a problem on offense usually.
You should at least, I mean, even in those late game situations, run a high ball screen, attack the rim, maybe force Minnesota into a foul, that sort of thing.
What you're doing is working, just do it now, and you have plenty of time, because it's not like it's a really slow developing offense. It's where you can get guys shots quickly, and the team shoots a high enough percentage where they go in a lot of the time, and we just didn't see that very often at all.
Well, and again, I mean, that kind of goes back to something that we've seen from Indiana a lot this year and didn't tonight, which is late game poise. I mean, you think about obviously the Michigan State game, the Michigan game, even to an extent after some tetchy moments against Minnesota at home, the Minnesota game at home. They just kind of didn't have it tonight, and it's certainly a lesson game. This team has always responded well. They still control their Big Ten destiny. When they're next to at home, they win at least a share of the regular season crown. That could be an outright regular season title, depending on what else happens in the league. The permutations are still too convoluted to really all address, and they could still win the whole thing outright, no matter what happens, by winning their last 3. And if they just win 2 of their last 3. A lot of the tiebreaker scenarios right now, if you were to assume kind of a basic way the conference schedule would fall out, or the conference standings would fall out, actually favor Indiana. So they still control their own destiny, but tonight was a chance to basically lock up the league.
Yeah.
Or
to make a huge step in locking up.
Yeah. and they just didn't do it. So Iowa on Saturday, we will be there as we always are. Perhaps some of you will be there. You would imagine it will be a better result for Indiana, but it's gonna. This is one probably. I mean, I think really not unlike the Butler game. This is one where Indiana probably needs to really take a long, hard look in the mirror and just kind of say, we've gotten to the threshold here, but we really, the last step is the hardest, and we're there now. So, we need to figure out how to do that. We can't just assume it's going to happen if we just keep operating at normal whatever. So, this thing's fizzling out, and he's got to go home because he's got school tomorrow. He's very sleepy.
Yeah.
But we'll see you at the weekend, if not before. For Alex McCarthy, I'm Zach Osterman. You've been watching Inside Indiana Overtime. Thanks for watching.